Please note that this is the very first time I've done a video like this, and I'm sure there are improvements that can be made. All characters are fictional, the ships are real. I just want to say I'm using as many external pictures of the ship that I can. However, if I can't find enough good quality ones, you may see repeat images, especially as the video is almost 20 minutes long. I do apologize for that. Ocean liners are the only way to cross the Atlantic. I crossed myself starting in New York. However, I actually live in Brandon, a small town in the Canadian province of Manitoba. I arrived in Europe on April 12, 1935, aboard my favorite ocean liner, and on her last voyage at that, the RMS Olympic, on a long business trip. I worked for Paddle Wheel Enterprises, a riverboat shipping company which was one of the largest in Canada, and I was in Europe investigating several potential partnerships for a possible European joint expansion with an existing company. I was in charge of the day-to-day operations and was the go-to guy for anything. So, when asked by the owner to go to Europe, I said yes right away. I also wrote travel experiences and trip reports for the various ships and trains that I traveled on somewhat regularly for my job, including our own. I was finally ready to leave on May 29, 1935, aboard the most luxurious ocean liner ever built, on its maiden voyage no less, the SS Normandie. No one back home knew that I was going to go on Normandie, as it was a last-minute switch. I was supposed to have left a few days earlier, but I had some last-minute business deals to attend to, and those were successful. And a few other executives will be coming to see our operations in a few months' time. I love to travel aboard ocean liners. However, I'd only sailed from Halifax or New York to Southampton, so I was really excited to not only be finally heading home, and to see my friends and family, but also sail from Le Havre, France, for the very first time. I arrived early that morning, around 8 o'clock. I wanted to see as much as I could. I looked around the port for about an hour before finally checking in, and about half an hour later, I finally set foot on board the SS Normandy at 9:30. It was love at first sight with the luxury liner. I've never seen such beauty, let alone on an ocean liner. The crew were some of the best that I had ever seen. They rivaled our crews, and ours were the best of the best. I was extremely impressed with my first time on a French line ship. I was greeted by a steward the second I stepped aboard. It must have been a record for the earliest greeting on my travels. I quickly asked where my cabin was, and to my shock, it was the very first far forward first-end cabin. The very first time I had been on a first-class one. First class seemed to embrace most of the ship, unlike any other ship I had ever seen. I nearly dropped my briefcase at the sight of her interiors. I quickly went to find my cabin, and this took until about 10:15, as I struggled to find the right cabin. Turned out, I was just overlooking my original cabin. I felt fairly foolish, but I soon got over it and explored my cabin. I spent the next 2 hours writing about what happened so far, as the ship was not scheduled to leave for another couple of hours. I like being productive, so I was okay with boarding early so I could get more work done and fit in as much detail as possible about this experience so far. Around 1300 hours, I went to the top deck to get a great view of the departure in only about 10 minutes. There was heaviness in the air from the much-anticipated maiden voyage of the luxury liner. The shoreline was blanketed by 50,000 people waiting to see the ground liner off. I was slightly concerned the moment the propeller started turning, however. Even though it seemed no one else could feel it yet, I could feel an almost undetectable vibration. Being extremely familiar with the very early symptoms with some of the riverboats back home, I could recognize it right away. I brushed it off, however, as the ship was a brand new ship, and I had felt it before on other ocean liners, and it was never an issue. The feeling soon passed as Normandy slowly parted waves with the pier, and just like that, we were off on the crossing of a lifetime. Before we crossed the Atlantic, however, the ship made a stop in Southampton to pick up more passengers and bring the total up to 1,007. Despite this, the ship did not feel crowded, as she could carry up to 1,972 passengers and had a crew of 1,345. It was the first time I'd been on board a ship with more crew than passengers. I spent the rest of the day in my cabin, except for dinner, which was the best I had ever had in the largest dining room at sea. I was doing paperwork going through the potential European partnership companies. I normally do paperwork back home to help out whenever I could, and doing the amount of paperwork with me would greatly help them and make the whole process go a lot smoother and quicker, as I had to go through all the paperwork later anyways. I would explore more of the ship in 2 days after I got the paperwork done. It is what I normally do on transatlantic voyages. The rest of the day went by fairly quickly, and it was soon 2200 hours, and I got ready and went to bed after the long but interesting day I had had. I woke up at 6. I'm an early bird, so I got ready for the day, then started on yet some more work before breakfast. However, I noticed something that no one told me and I didn't originally spot. Now, I've been calling the Normandie's owners the French line. However, that's only the North American name for them. Their French name is Compagnie Generale Transatlantique, or CGT for short. I spotted CGT's logo and then I realized that the most promising partner was owned by the French line. This could be a disaster if any crew saw this piece of paper with the logo on it, as there wasn't supposed to be any public knowledge of this potential partnership, and I was informed to keep it as close to my heart as humanly possible. Around 8, I went for breakfast, but before I left my cabin, I made sure that piece of paper with the logo on it was back in my briefcase and locked it, as I previously mentioned, the European expansion needed to be completely secret until both of our companies and the other company, when chosen, announced it in a grand ceremony in each company's founding towns and cities. Breakfast was amazing, but I was slightly distracted with the thought of that paper I had found with the French line's logo on it. Surely someone on board must have known, and the French line had high-ranking executives on board the maiden voyage of Normandy. I went back to my cabin around 9, now walking around pins and needles to avoid anyone who was potentially a French line executive. To my horror, as I neared my cabin, I saw 5 people who looked exactly like French line executives enter the cabin right next door to mine. I walked a bit faster and was relieved when I entered and shut the door to my own cabin. While I was in my cabin, I overheard one of the 5 men in the next room saying not only my personal name, but also the name of the company. The only good thing I overheard was them not knowing what cabin I was in, as it was actually booked under a false name that only myself and our company owner knew, so the crew wouldn't have a chance to recognize it. Now, I should have written this before I left France, but my trip was top secret. The several involved companies and my employer wanted to finalize everything before it went public. Even if this wasn't the case, I tried to stay low anyways, as I don't like the spotlight, which the crew most certainly would put on me considering who I was and the work that I did. I did some more work to try to get my mind off things and managed to finish a day earlier than I expected to. Then, at 12:20, I went to lunch. Luckily, the executives ate lunch in a separate room off of the main hall, likely to keep whatever their discussions were a secret, as I've seen and heard about this happening many times before. I've even done it myself. I saw them enter it right as I entered the dining hall, which was a relief. I finished lunch around 50 minutes later at 13:10 and went back to my cabin to write about the experience of the first half of the day. I was nervous as I just had a feeling that someone on board, I didn't know who, but I've had a feeling someone on board knew who I was and could see through my false name. Mind you, I saw the crew loading blue ribbon medallions and a large 30-foot blue pendant flag, even though the French line refused to predict if the Normandie would take away the blue ribbon from the Italian ocean liner SS Rex. Personally, I think that the Normandie can, and will take the record for the first time for a French-owned and registered ship. I don't mean to brag, but I know almost anything to do with ships. That's why I chose my current job with Padwheel Enterprises. Oh, where did the time go? It's already 18:25. Guess I should head to dinner. I left my cabin and headed for the hall when I overheard someone talking behind me mention my name once more. I didn't look back, I just kept going, as they hadn't mentioned my false name. They turned off just before the hall, adrenaline filled my brain, like helium, to a balloon. I was tense during dinner. The waiter, who I had so far had for the entire voyage, noticed this. He didn't say anything, but I could tell with his body language and the tone of his voice, as it shifted to a more concerning tone. I didn't let on that I could see that he noticed, but I think he might recognize me. I hope not. It's probably just the adrenaline messing with my brain. I didn't think much more about it for the rest of dinner. Oh, sorry, I haven't explained much about the Grand Hall. The Grand Hall of a first-class dining room. It was the best meal I'd ever had so far. Everything was impressive, and my system for rating ships and the experience on board was being torn to shreds by the grand and luxurious Normandie in the largest dining hall at sea. I finished my dinner, and I will explore more of the ship in the morning to try and get my mind off things. But before heading back to my cabin, I walked around the outside areas of the ship, and in the stern around the propeller shafts, I felt a terrible vibration yet again. That of Normandie wasn't brand new, may have taken her stern clean off. This rattled me more than a rattlesnake, and I don't just mean physically. Headed back to my cabin to try to determine what could be causing these stern vibrations, as they were so bad, and that ships like this had problems over the years. However, I never made it back to my cabin. I actually only got in with about 100 feet when the same server I had at dinner stopped me. He motioned for me to follow him, but said nothing, which strikes me as very odd, but maybe he didn't know that I speak several languages, including French. Wait, then we're in the last hallway that leads only to the bridge. That is not good for secrecy, and being led to the bridge almost never ends well. I normally have a backup plan, but I was caught so off guard this time that I didn't notice until the last hallway, which is very unlike me. My family would kill me if found out. Oh boy, then there's the bridge door. Well, here goes nothing. The steward opened the door. Now, I can't write the conversation due to company policy. However, I can share the general topic of the conversation, which went way better than I had expected. But it was a shocker. Turns out the French line actually knew my false name, which had been given to them back in April by my boss unbeknownst to me. All of Normandie's crew knew, along with the 5 French line executives that were on board, and they were having the meetings in the cabins beside mine, and this was on purpose so I would overhear them. But they didn't know until I told them that I figured out who they were, that I had already figured it out. They were in fact coming to Brandon with me to visit Padwheel Enterprises and work out the final details for our European expansion. However, the conversation quickly turned to the extreme vibrations I, along with everyone in the stern, had felt. So, the captain, chief engineer, the 5 executives, and I went to the engine room to inspect the propeller shafts. I noticed the issue right away. The shaft was wobbling. Some ships back home had the very same problem, and we had to change the propellers. I suspect that the 3-bladed propellers were the root cause, and, based on past experience, thought the propellers actually needed to be 4-bladed. I told this to the others, and, after some discussions, they agreed that it was very plausible, and the solution would be very simple, just putting on different propellers. However, we wouldn't know for sure until propellers could be designed, made, and finally installed on the Normandie. The 8 of us agreed that passengers from the above cabins had to be moved so they were not sitting over the stern, and this was done over the next hour or so, just to make the voyages for them more comfortable, as the vibrations were worse than any of us had ever felt, or even heard of at that. I know this seems fast, but this all finished around 2200 hours, and we all went back to our cabins and went to bed, as we were all very tired, most of us have been up since 6 or 7. Hopefully the rest of the crossing is calmer and less eventful. Despite going to bed around 22:45, I still woke up at 6 a.m. the next morning like normal. I spent an hour or so thinking about the events that had happened so far, and I am so confused about not being told that the crew knew about me. There is something that is being hidden from me. I just know it. I went to breakfast at 7:30, a little earlier than I have so far. I was hoping to beat the crowds so I could have some more quiet thoughts, but I have terrible luck. I walked into the dining hall and saw the off-duty bridge crew, some other off-shift crew, and the 5 executives were there. Oh boy, I was annoyed. I was tired even though I didn't feel it, as I normally don't get annoyed. I turned around and left. They were facing away from me, so I don't think that they saw me. I went back to the outer decks and walked around for a few hours before finally heading back to my own cabin, where I stayed until 1300 hours, when I went back to the dining hall for lunch, and it was very quiet, which I was grateful for. Around 1400 hours, I headed back to my cabin to write about the past 24 hours and the weird feelings I was having. I was purposely avoiding people as much as humanly possible, just to try to calm my million-mile brain down. I started reading a book about riverboats, which I started reading a few months ago and had about a quarter of it left. I just continued reading until 1825, when I went back to the dining hall for dinner, which was also quiet, and I think the crew may have been giving me my space, as I suspect that my boss told them that I don't like the spotlight. This day was super quiet, and there was at least a day left on the voyage, and I hoped it would be a quiet and boring one too. I managed to chill out by 2100 hours, and started to think about the expansion again. I have a feeling that my boss wants me to do trips similar to this when European expansion gets up and running. However, I don't know if I want to do this every month or so. I'm a prairie guy through and through. World travel just doesn't suit me anymore. I'll have to ask about him when I get back home. I hope that he doesn't want me to or respects my decision. Knowing how good of a guy that he is, I have a feeling he will. Well, it's 22:15. I'll write more in the morning. I woke up at 7, which was late for me, got ready, and around 7:45, I went for breakfast. But right as I walked up to the dining hall entrance, the 5 executives stopped me and led me into the meeting room that they had been using, and the 5 of them are super nice, and we talked about both there and the company that I work for, Paddle Wheel Enterprises, and the expansion over breakfast, and then lunch. We didn't stop the meeting until 1600 hours. We were supposed to arrive in New York in about an hour and a half, so I went onto the top deck with 5 executives to see the entrance to the large New York harbor. And not too long later, we saw the Statue of Liberty. I thought 50,000 back in the harbor was a large crowd. Well, New York City's New York City. There were over 100,000 people in an impenetrable sea of people. This was a shock for both the 5 executives and I. After all, we had seen a lot of people in one place before, but this topped it by far. Normandie docked at New York's Pier 88 at 17:30. The executive said that they would meet me in Brandon and that there were a few people waiting for me on the pier. I was slightly confused by this, as I wasn't aware of anybody meeting me on the pier. And to his family, they would have said so in the many letters we had sent each other while I was overseas. It's just another thing being hidden from me, but it's probably just a surprise. Wait, then why would someone tell me that I was meeting someone? I returned to my cabin, grabbed my suitcase, as well as my briefcase, which I'd packed earlier before breakfast, and headed off to the ship onto the pier. I was not expecting the 2 people who saw me. It was my boss and company owner, Mr. Hallstrand, and my twin sister Astrid. But neither of them had a happy look on their face, and I instantly knew that something was very wrong. And it was bad, given the look on both their faces, especially Astrid and Mr. Hall, as I had never seen them look mad before. So I asked, "What's wrong, sis?"